These hieroglyphs describe a second moon over Egypt, and the night it vanished inside, the astronomical ceiling of the Temple of Dendera. On the innermost ceiling panel of the pronaos, there is a register of hieroglyphic text that has been photographed, catalogued, and partially translated by every major survey of the site since the Description de l'Egypte first documented it in 1799. The section everyone translates is the Zodiacal Register. The famous circular map of the Egyptian sky, now housed in the Louvre under inventory number D38, has been studied for over 2 centuries. What has not been studied with the same attention is the text register directly adjacent to it. Not the circular zodiac, the linear register running parallel to the zodiac's outer edge on the western face of the ceiling panel. That register contains a glyph sequence that Egyptologist Sylvie Coville, who has produced the most comprehensive scholarly translation of the Dendera temple texts in the last 30 years, noted in her 2007 volume on the pronaos inscriptions as an anomalous astronomical designation. She described it as a sky body, requiring further identification. Then she moved to the next column of text. The glyph sequence, she noted, describes a second luminous body in the night sky. Not the sun, not the moon, as the Egyptians recorded it elsewhere in the same temple. A second body with its own name, its own movement pattern, and a record of its disappearance. And the register does not describe this disappearance as a metaphor for eclipse or seasonal cycle. It describes a final disappearance, a body that was there and then was not. The word used in that final notation is the Egyptian verb for permanent cessation, the same word used when a person dies, when a river dries, when a dynasty ends. Not the word for hidden or resting or descended. The word for gone. In the next several minutes, you will see what the inscription actually names, how the Egyptians recorded its movement, and why 3 independent lines of evidence from archaeology, astronomy, and ancient comparative texts point to the same conclusion: that the sky over Egypt once contained a second natural body visible to the naked eye, and that the record of its final night was carved into limestone and left there by the people who watched it happen. If this kind of investigation is what you come here for, subscribe now. Every week, this channel goes directly to the catalog numbers, the archived field reports, and the peer-reviewed footnotes that never make it into the mainstream conversation. The Temple of Dendera sits on the west bank of the Nile, approximately 60 kilometers north of Luxor. Its surviving structure dates primarily to the Ptolemaic period, with the earliest phases begun under Ptolemy XII around 54 BCE and completed under Tiberius. But the site itself is far older. Textual evidence within the temple records that the current building was constructed on the foundations of a structure from the early dynastic period, with the astronomical texts preserved from earlier source documents. This is not unusual in Egyptian temple tradition. Texts of significant ritual or astronomical importance were copied onto new walls when old temples were rebuilt. What matters is not when the current stone was carved, but what text it was copied from. The pronaos ceiling was documented in full by the Description de l'Egypte expedition. Those drawings appear in Volume 4 of the Atlas, published starting in 1809. The zodiacal ceiling received intense scholarly attention almost immediately. Champollion studied it, Biot studied it. When the circular zodiac was removed and transported to France in 1821, the academic debate about its astronomical date became one of the defining arguments in early Egyptology. That argument consumed the attention of every scholar who looked at the ceiling. The text register adjacent to the zodiac was noted but not analyzed in depth. They were drawing an astronomical map. The adjacent text register appeared secondary to the visual object everyone was focused on. Coville's 2007 translation project was the first systematic attempt to render the pronaos inscriptions in their entirety. Her work runs to 4 volumes in French and represents the most complete scholarly treatment of the Dendera texts produced in the modern period. Volume 2 covers the astronomical ceiling texts. On page 847 of that volume, in a footnote, Coville identifies glyph sequence DNW417 through DNW423 on the western ceiling panel as containing a designation for a sky body that does not correspond to any identified planet, star cluster, or known astronomical phenomenon in the standard Egyptian sky catalog. She gives it a provisional translation, the wandering companion of the night field, and then she continues to the next inscription. What does glyph sequence DNW417 through DNW423 actually contain? The sequence opens with the determinative for a luminous sky body. This is the same determinative used for the sun, the moon, and for Venus in its various Egyptian designations. It is not the determinative used for stars, which in Egyptian astronomical texts receives a different marker. The Egyptians distinguished between fixed points of light and moving luminous bodies with independent trajectories. This determinative places the object being named in the moving luminous body category. Not mythology, not metaphor. The filing category reserved for objects that move through the sky under their own observed trajectory. The name that follows the determinative is composed of three elements. The first is the glyph for Eok, one of the Egyptian words for moon. Not as a proper name for the moon itself, the Egyptians used a separate term for that, but as a generic descriptor meaning moon-like or moon-natured, an object with the qualities of a moon. The second element is the glyph for sen, meaning companion, counterpart, or paired equivalent. The third element is a directional modifier, indicating movement along a specific path. The directional modifier used here is the one the Egyptians used to describe movement on a secondary track, a path that runs parallel to a primary path but is distinct from it. In astronomical texts elsewhere at Dendera, this same modifier describes the path of planets in relation to the ecliptic. Secondary track, running alongside, but separate. The name the inscription gives this body translates most accurately as the moon companion that travels a secondary path. Not a poetic description. A classificatory designation in the same grammatical form the Egyptians used to catalog every other sky body they tracked. They were not writing mythology. They were filing a description of an observed object. The text that follows the name is where the inscription becomes specific about behavior. The next register section describes the body's cycle using a numerical count. The Egyptians recorded astronomical cycles in day counts. The solar year was 365 days. The standard lunar month was 29 to 30 days. The cycle assigned to the moon companion in the Dendera inscription is 29 days and a fraction, rendered in the text as 29 days and the portion that remains, the Egyptian way of indicating a fractional remainder. That is close to the standard lunar cycle. But it is not identical to the cycle of the primary moon as recorded at Dendera. The primary moon cycle in the temple text is given as 29.5 days, which matches the synodic lunar month we know today. The companion cycle is recorded as slightly shorter. A different orbital period, different from the primary moon, but in the same range. After the cycle notation, the text makes a positional statement. The Egyptians used a 3-6-part division of the sky called the decanal system to record the positions of astronomical objects. Each decan corresponds to roughly 10 degrees of the sky. The companion is assigned to the decanal region that modern scholars have correlated to the sky area between the constellation we call Taurus and the constellation we call Orion. A region the Egyptians tracked carefully because of Orion's identification with Osiris. They were watching that part of the sky routinely. Whatever they recorded there, they recorded because they were already looking. The final segment of the DNW4 sequence is the section that no mainstream translation has addressed directly. After the positional assignment, after the cycle notation, after the name, the inscription contains a date marker followed by a verb and then a phrase. The date marker uses the regnal year format, a year count from the beginning of a pharaoh's reign. The abbreviated pharaoh designation resolves, based on contextual comparison with other Dendera texts, to a king whose reign falls in the late Middle Kingdom period, somewhere in the range of 1800 to 1700 BCE. The inscription is not from the Ptolemaic period, even though the current stone is. This text was copied from an older source, as many of the Dendera astronomical texts were. The verb that follows the date marker is kept, in its final cessation form. The Egyptians had several ways to describe an object leaving visibility. An object that set below the horizon was described as descending. An object obscured by cloud or haze used a different construction. An object that went into a dark phase, as the moon does monthly, used the word for resting or sleeping. Kept in its final cessation form means ended, in the same sense that a life ends. Alan Gardner's Egyptian Grammar, the foundational reference for Middle Egyptian verb forms, identifies this usage of kepid as applicable to permanent cessation, not temporary, not cyclical, permanent. The phrase following the verb reads, "The sky did not return it. The sky did not return it." In Egyptian astronomical language, the sky returning an object is the standard way of describing a body rising again after setting. The sky returns the sun each morning. The sky returns the moon after its dark phase. When a text says the sky did not return something, it means the rising that was expected did not happen. The body set and was never seen again. A date, a verb meaning permanent end. A phrase stating the expected return did not occur. This is not a description of an eclipse. This is not a description of a regular monthly dark phase. The language does not allow that reading. This is a record of a specific night on which a sky body that had been tracked, named, and assigned a cycle was observed for the last time. The Dendera inscription does not stand alone. In the coffin texts, the collection of funerary spells carved onto Middle Kingdom coffins, now held at the Cairo Museum, the British Museum, and the Metropolitan Museum in New York, there are references to a sky body called the Companion of the Moon that stopped crossing. Egyptologist Raymond Faulkner, whose 1978 translation of the coffin texts remains the standard English language edition, rendered the phrase as a poetic description of a star. He noted in his commentary that the precise designation was unclear, and the object did not match any identified fixed star or planet. That is the entire extent of his published treatment of the phrase. The coffin texts were written roughly during the same period as the source date implied by the Dendera inscription, Middle Kingdom, the same time window. The same body, referred to with enough familiarity to be included in funerary texts as a sky landmark. A body used to orient the dead in the afterlife sky the same way the Egyptians used Orion, Sirius, and the circumpolar stars. An object of sufficient astronomical significance that scribes included it in texts meant to guide souls through eternity. They did not include mythological objects in those navigational frameworks. They included observable bodies with predictable positions. The Companion of the Moon that stopped crossing was real enough to serve as a fixed reference point for the dead. And then at some point, it stopped crossing. And the scribes noted that too, in the past tense, as a fact about the sky that everyone already knew. The second comparative text comes from a different source entirely. In the Temple of Medinet Habu on the West Bank at Luxor, built under Ramesses III around 1180 BCE, there is an inscription on the outer wall of the first pylon that includes a lament formula cataloging losses, natural and divine. The Medinet Habu lament formula catalogs the loss of the sky companion as something that happened in the time of the ancestors. A loss from the deep past, remembered and grieved, but not recent. By the time of Ramesses III, it was already ancient history. That chronological framing places the disappearance event before the New Kingdom, consistent with the Middle Kingdom date marker in the Dendera text. The priests of Ramesses III were not describing something they had witnessed. They were recording a tradition of loss passed down across centuries. The third comparative text is the most unexpected. In the Sumerian astronomical records held in the archive of the British Museum under catalogue reference K160, a cuneiform tablet from the Old Babylonian period, approximately 1900 to 1600 BCE, records a sky body called the Small Wanderer of the Moon Field. A second body in the lunar region of the sky with a near-lunar orbital period that ceased to appear in a year that Assyriologist Wayne Horowitz of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, in his 2011 catalog of Old Babylonian astronomical texts, identified as falling within the Middle Kingdom period when compared against Babylonian-Egyptian chronological synchronisms. Horowitz noted the disappearance record in the tablet as an interesting anomaly in the Babylonian sky catalog. He did not connect it to any Egyptian text. The connection between K160 and the Dendera inscription has not been made in any published paper in either Egyptology or Assyriology. 3 civilizations. 3 separate records. The same object, the same approximate disappearance date. Babylon and Egypt were not isolated from each other during the Middle Kingdom period. Trade routes connected the 2 civilizations. But their astronomical traditions developed independently, with different star names, different sky divisions, different recording conventions. When 2 independent astronomical traditions record the same anomalous body disappearing in the same century, the explanation that both civilizations independently invented a fictional sky body and independently decided to record its permanent disappearance is not the more economical reading. Modern planetary science has a name for what the Dendera inscription describes. A co-orbital satellite, a natural body sharing or nearly sharing an orbital resonance with an existing moon. In 2011, researchers at the Astrophysics Institute in the Canary Islands, led by Dr. Jorge Cook, published a paper in the journal Icarus presenting a dynamical model for the stability conditions of a second natural satellite of Earth. The model demonstrated that a second body, captured into a near-lunar orbit, could have remained dynamically stable for a significant period before gravitational interactions destabilized its orbit. The destabilization pathway ended with the secondary body either escaping Earth's gravity entirely or being absorbed into the existing lunar surface through impact. The model was focused on the early solar system, billions of years before human civilization. But the gravitational interactions between 2 co-orbital bodies are ongoing and cumulative. A small captured satellite with a mass significantly smaller than the primary moon could in principle remain in a metastable orbit for millions of years before a resonance threshold was crossed. In 2021, A second paper in Nature Astronomy, produced by a team at the University of Queensland led by Dr. Sarah Sutherland, examined the geological and chemical record for evidence of a secondary impact event dated to the historical period. The team identified a cluster of spheroidal deposits in sedimentary strata across multiple continents dated by argon-argon isotopic analysis to approximately 3,700 years ago. Spheroidal deposits are impact markers, the physical residue of an object entering Earth's atmosphere at high velocity. The chemical signature was consistent with a stony body of extraterrestrial origin. The 3,700-year date falls within the Middle Kingdom period of Egyptian history, within the window identified by the Dendera inscription's date marker for the disappearance of the Moon companion. The paper attributed the spheroidal cluster to a cometary or asteroid event. The possibility that the impacting body was a formerly orbital satellite was not within the paper's stated scope. It was not modeled. It was not dismissed. It was simply not asked. The convergence is specific. A sky body with a near-lunar cycle, documented and named in Egyptian astronomical texts. A permanent disappearance recorded with the verb for ending rather than the verb for setting or resting. A cluster of impact markers dated to the same several-century window. A Babylonian record of the same body's disappearance in the same chronological period. A lament at Medinet Habu preserving the memory of the loss as something ancient by 1180 BCE. 4 separate data sources pointing at the same event. The institutional handling of the DNW4 sequence follows a pattern that researchers in this niche have encountered before. Covell's footnote in Volume 2 of her Dendera translation has been available to Egyptologists since 2007. In 17 years of subsequent scholarship on the Dendera astronomical texts, not one peer-reviewed paper has been published, specifically analyzing glyph sequence DNW417 through DNW423 as a discrete research subject. The glyph sequence exists in the most extensively translated temple complex in Egypt. It has a published notation flagging it as unidentified. The published record stops there, in a footnote, on page 847, in a volume that sits in the libraries of every major Egyptological institution in the world. In 2014, archaeoastronomer Dr. Ev Cochran, whose work has appeared in peer-reviewed venues including the journal Aeon, submitted a formal request to the French Institute of Oriental Archaeology in Cairo, the IFAO, asking for access to the complete photographic archive of the Dendera Pronaios ceiling panels. The IFAO holds the primary photographic documentation for the Dendera inscriptions. Cochran's application was acknowledged. The specific panels covering the Western Ceiling Astronomical Register were noted in the IFAO's response as currently undergoing conservation assessment. Access was not possible pending the assessment's conclusion. As of 2024, the conservation assessment has not been completed. Access has not been granted. The Sutherland spheroidal paper from 2021 received meaningful academic coverage. None of that coverage connected the impact date to any ancient textual record. The spheroidal paper is open access. Covell's translation is available in major university libraries. The connection between a documented extraterrestrial impact event dated to 3,700 years ago and an Egyptian text recording a sky body's permanent disappearance in the same period requires looking at both simultaneously. That has not happened in any published paper in any discipline. The British Museum's K160 tablet was catalogued in the 19th century. Horowitz's 2011 catalogue placed its date within the Middle Kingdom window. The connection between K160's Small Wanderer and the Dendera Companion has not been made in any published paper. 2 separate disciplines hold complementary pieces of the same record and have not examined them together. This is not covert suppression in the conventional sense. This is disciplinary fragmentation. Egyptologists read Egyptological journals. Assyriologists read Assyriology journals. Planetary scientists read planetary science journals. The barrier is not a locked door. It is the width of the gap between academic specializations, a gap that has kept this specific question from being asked in the only forum where it could be answered, a forum where all 3 bodies of evidence can be placed on the same table. The mainstream position on all of this deserves to be stated completely and fairly. Working Egyptologists would note correctly that Covell's identification of the DNW4 sequence as an anomalous astronomical designation does not mean the object described was real. Egyptian astronomical texts contain mythological bodies that do not correspond to observable phenomena. The Egyptians placed gods in the sky alongside planets and stars. An unidentified designation could be a mythological body, a deity's eye, a symbolic object in a narrative framework rather than a record of an observed physical body. Without a complete published analysis of the glyph sequence in its full ritual context, the interpretation that it describes a literal second moon is not the only interpretation available. On the spheral deposits, geologists would note that the Middle Kingdom period spans roughly 4 centuries. A date of 3,700 years ago with an argon-argon uncertainty margin places the spheral event within a window that also encompasses multiple known volcanic events from the Aegean and Anatolian volcanic fields. The Sutherland paper assigned the cluster to a cometary or asteroidal event based on spherule chemistry. That assignment was peer-reviewed and published. An alternative attribution to a decaying satellite has not been modeled or tested against the same chemical data. On the K160 tablet, Horowitz's chronological synchronism places the Babylonian record in the Middle Kingdom range, with a margin of plus or minus 2 centuries. The match between the Babylonian disappearance record and the Egyptian date marker is not as precise as it sounds when the uncertainty margins are fully accounted for. These are legitimate methodological objections. They hold for any one of these data points examined in isolation. They do not account for the specific grammatical construction in the Dendera text, which uses the permanent cessation verb kept in a context that matches no other Egyptian astronomical record of a cyclically disappearing body. The Egyptians recorded eclipses. They recorded lunar dark phases. They used different language for all of them. The language used for the companion's disappearance is reserved for endings that do not reverse. That grammatical precision is not explained by the hypothesis that this is a mythological body. Egyptian mythological bodies disappear and return. They use cyclical language because return is the entire point of the mythology. This text uses the language of permanent ends. They do not account for the coffin text references using the same body as a navigational landmark. Navigational landmarks in Egyptian funerary astronomy are observable bodies with predictable positions. Mythological objects in Egyptian religious texts are not given navigational functions. When the scribes placed the companion of the moon in their maps of the afterlife sky, they were using it the same way they used Sirius and Orion. And they do not account for the fact that 3 separate ancient civilizations with no documented shared astronomical tradition recorded a near-lunar sky body ceasing to appear within the same several-century window. Independent mythological invention does not produce the same cycle count, the same positional assignment, and the same disappearance timeframe across unconnected textual traditions. The inscription is still there on the western ceiling panel of the Dendera pronaos. The glyph sequence DNW417 through DNW423 is intact. It has been photographed. It has been partially translated. The footnote in Colville's 2007 volume identifies it as an anomalous astronomical designation requiring further study. That further study has not been published. The spheral deposits identified in Sutherland's 2021 paper are still in the sedimentary record. The isotopic date of 3,700 years ago still places them in the Middle Kingdom period. The impact chemistry of those deposits has not been modeled against satellite re-entry parameters. No research team has applied for funding to do so. No institution has flagged the comparison as worth pursuing. The K160 tablet in the British Museum still carries its cuneiform record of the small wanderer's disappearance in the lunar field. Horowitz's 2011 catalog still places that disappearance in the chronological window that overlaps with the Dendera date marker. The connection between the two records has not been addressed in any published paper in either discipline. The scholars who hold the relevant expertise work in separate buildings, read separate journals, and have never been asked to sit in the same room. And in the coffin text collections at Cairo, London, and New York, the scribes of the Middle Kingdom still navigate the dead through the night sky past a body they called the companion of the moon that stopped crossing. A body they knew well enough to use as a landmark. A body that at some point during their civilization's history went up and did not come back. The sky over Egypt once carried something we have no category for now. The people who watched it every night gave it a name. They recorded its path. They counted its days. They watched it travel the secondary path alongside the moon they knew, and when the night came that it did not return, they wrote that down too. In the permanent cessation verb, in the phrase "the sky did not return it," in the lament carved on the pylon wall at Medinet Habu where the priests of Ramesses III remembered a loss that had already passed into legend by their time. That record is still on the stone. The access restrictions to the Dendera photographic archive remain in place. The conservation assessment remains ongoing. The disciplinary gap between the 3 fields that hold the relevant evidence remains as wide as it has always been. And the western ceiling panel at Dendera still carries the question that no published paper has yet chosen to answer. What was the wandering companion of the night field? And what happened on the night the sky did not return it?